Okay, the gates have opened. The counter machine is counting. Since the 1970s, there have been spreading dissatisfactions with the system, economic and political. This is a conference on how the government could address some of these dissatisfactions. One comment I would make is that some of the initiatives proposed by the new politicians, from the progressives to the socialists, appeared to me, at any rate, to rest on questionable tenets and theories, and that criticism applies to some of Trump's initiatives too, notably his tax cut. For me, it's lamentable that so many politicians feel free to disregard tenets of what might be called standard economics. I understand that this body of theory makes postulates that abstract from more of reality than is comfortable, but it does not follow that all the tenets of the standard economics are wrong. Another comment I would make is that the proposed initiatives that we've been talking about appear to focus on the middle class and the middle earner, with no attention to the working class in general and the least advantaged in particular. Lastly, politicians have not grasped the deep sources of the malaise. Regarding fiscal and tax policy, there has been a consensus in standard economics, that in general, taxes ought to be high enough to finance total government outlays, provided aggregate demand is strong enough, or becoming strong enough, to deliver the equilibrium or natural unemployment rate. Franco Modigliani argued in a 1961 paper that a public debt drives a wedge between wealth and capital, and a bigger public debt drives a bigger wedge. A 1966 monograph of mine argued that as households come to own voluminous holdings of federal debt, they are misled into thinking they are richer than they really are, which leads them to make some bad decisions. In a Ramseyan model, as I've since shown, a surge of public debt with perfect forecasting the rest of the way into the future, a surge of public debt steepens the path of wealth and flattens the path of the capital stock, creating a larger and larger wedge between capital and wealth. That's sort of obvious when you think about it. So it was an act of utter disregard of all this when, at the end of 2017, Donald Trump pushed through the legislative body a deep cut of tax rates on corporate profits, allegedly to boost corporate hiring and investing, without raising other tax rates enough to avoid a huge increase of the fiscal deficit. This strikes me as a quintessential example of populism, catering to a populace that is largely ignorant of the existing economics on the costs of a long-run sustained deficit. Some other isms, a revival of progressivism and low-strength socialism, have sprouted up in the country, and they deserve hearing and evaluations. 2019 has seen a welter of wealth tax proposals. Socialist Bernie Sanders has called for a rising schedule of annual taxes on those with a net worth in excess of $32 million. For him, this tax would not be valued as a way to raise income among the poor people. There are too few billionaires and too many working poor to make such of a dent. But as he has said, this tax would express his revulsion of high wealth. He simply doesn't like high wealth. It's not the consequences of getting rid of it. The arch-progressive Elizabeth Warren sees her more aggressive plan to tax wealth as a means to finance her proposals for universal child care, student debt cancellation, and tuition-free public colleges. Put aside the practical difficulty of locating and assessing the wealth to be taxed. There is the question of what effects an annual 2% or 3% tax on wealth would have on wealthy people's use of their existing wealth. How would such a tax affect the investment and saving required to create projects bringing a before-tax rate of return of just 5%, say, on the investment? The sort of investing that society needs to see in the economy is quite risky. It faces Knightian uncertainty. So the prospect of a 3% tax per annum on wealth created might deter an appreciable amount of that kind of investment. But then again, perhaps it would not. It's hard to be sure. Not everyone invests for a high return. There may be non-material motives, as Richard Robb, I believe, has pointed out. Why not increase the tax rates on corporate profits, where profits are well defined, unlike wealth, which is kind of a mess? The late Gary Becker, the Chicago economist, is reported to have believed that the optimum tax rate on profits, on the returns on capital, is zero. That belief has perhaps been behind the reluctance to raise the tax rate on profits very far. A series of papers begun by both James Mirrlees and Eitan Shishensky in 1971, then the Rawlsian papers by Anthony Atkinson, myself, and Janusz Ordover in 1974, later papers by Anthony Atkinson and Joseph Stiglitz in 1976, and culminating in the 1979 papers by Ordover and Phelps, and by Phelps and Riley, have not found that it is optimal on any criterion that we used to maintain a zero tax on profits. In short, you ought to be taxing profits. Would be inoptimal not to do that, contrary to the Chicago view. Another point came out of my 1974 paper. The model there was inspired by Rawls's theory of economic justice, which calls for redistributive taxation to raise the wage of the least advantaged workers to the highest level possible. In this 1974 model, this justice requires solving for the schedule of marginal tax rates that would maximize the tax revenue out of which the government can pay the largest possible subsidy to the least paid, to the lowest earners. Some years, a little later, Rawls was asked, what about other government programs such as Adam Smith's national defense that many people might want the government to provide? Rawls is said to have answered that it is up to the least advantaged to decide how much of the subsidy to which they are entitled they are willing to part with, willing to sacrifice for this other lesser objective. But whatever the preferences are in that regard about the myriad programs, justice still requires maximum tax revenue from the Rawlsian perspective. Now, from this perspective, just as it might well be impractical to introduce the massive, long-awaited wage subsidies without first determining what the maximum tax revenue is, it seems impractical to introduce a welter of new socialist and progressivist programs without estimating what the maximum tax revenue is. My own preference is to give precedence to economic justice, as Rawls argued. Then society can get a sense of how much revenue the least advantaged is willing to give up for universal child care, student debt cancellation, and tuition-free public colleges, to mention the goals of Senator Warren. Two more remarks on tax rates. When we take action to achieve some of the legislative goals of Senators Warren and Sanders, we will cause huge increases in federal government spending. Very likely, many of the progressives and socialists are taking it for granted that the federal government will succeed in increasing revenue one way or another to cover the expenditures. No doubt many would expect that a great deal of additional resources could be raised by reversing the Trump tax cuts on corporate profits. But we are far from being sure how much revenue has been lost with the cut in those tax rates, so it would be hard to obtain quickly a tight estimate of the revenue gained from reverting to the old profits tax rate. And many seem to regard it as unnecessary to raise additional revenue to pay for their new programs. Apparently, they think the new programs will somehow pay for themselves, or they think that it's not really essential to close such a budgetary deficit as long as economic growth goes on at any rate. But closing down Trump's initiatives could be expected to have a short-run Keynesian effect on aggregate demand, which might give legislators pause before signing on to the abolition of the Trump cuts. While I feel the appeal of this new wave of proposals and the Rawlsian wave of proposals in the 1970s as well, I want to try, in the little time remaining, to suggest that the agenda of the progressives and socialists cannot come even close to what is necessary to regain the prosperity of old. A deep malady developing in American society, a problem out of reach of the reforms we've been hearing about from the politicians, is the decline in the experience of work. Jobs largely retain their material rewards, I think. No doubt, people continue to feel their job makes them feel a part of society, a way of belonging. What about the non-material rewards? Americans once stood out for their deep desire to succeed at something. I've argued elsewhere that this was the true American dream, which drove people to set out to the far country in hopes of building something. Now it is not clear that this urge to succeed is as widespread in today's young people as it was from, say, 1870 to 1970. Equally strong, perhaps, and central to my thesis on flourishing was was many Americans mentally was many Americans' mental engagement in the workplace. Finally, many people in a company's workforce would look around for a better way to do something or a new thing to produce. Gunnar Myrdal, in a book that's sometime in the 1920s, but I didn't have time to look up the reference. I've cited it about 5 times. Gunnar Myrdal exclaimed, referring to Sweden's workplace, he said that many people live to work. They don't work to live. And my book, Mass Flourishing, views this as a way, this sort of life as a way that ordinary people, by which ordinary people might flourish. It views this sort of experience, and as an example of what the good life is. Now, much of that seems to have disappeared from working life in America. Fewer Americans appear to want careers rich in the non-material experiences I was talking about. And more Americans are fixated on the material. In fact, there has been an outbreak of greed. The pharmaceuticals sale of addictive drugs and the doctors prescribing them, the protection of market share at the expense of airplane safety, the neglect of climate change. The causes are not all known, of course. It is now known, though, that the desire for the non-material rewards is, or maybe I should say, was fueled by humanist values that arose first in the Renaissance and continued to emerge. So it is quite possible that an important cause of the loss of flourishing in America is a loss of the right values in America. And all the proposals of the politicians don't begin to touch on this basic problem. However, it is possible too that, as suggested in Mass Flourishing, there have been barriers to new firms bearing new ideas, with the result that there are far fewer corporations in which work is oriented toward conceiving of new methods and new products. It is a fact that the number of new entrants into America's economy has been trending down for at least the last 3 decades for which we have data. It may be true that the enterprises that sprung up with the information revolution continue to be hothouses for the human imagination. But Silicon Valley, I owe this number to Joe Stiglitz, Silicon Valley produces only about 5% of the GDP. What about the other 95%? So the IT revolution does not appear to refute the hypothesis that the number of startups has been trending down. So unless we can make some profound changes in the character of society and through that the organization of the economy, we are going to go on having many rather sick, unfulfilled, frustrated people in our nation. And with the arrival of climate change, and now the arrival of artificial intelligence, we're going to face a formidable challenge over the near future. Thank you very much.
I've entitled my presentation continuing on the theme that Ned has spoken on, taxation and employment subsidies to achieve intra-generational and intergenerational economic justice. The English economist Alfred Marshall argued that work is central to people's lives. He said, "The business by which a person earns his livelihood generally fills his thoughts during by far the greater part of those hours in which his mind is at its best. During them, his character is being formed by his work and by his relations to his associates in work." While highlighting the importance of the non-pecuniary, the non-material aspects of work, as in that quote, Marshall has also remarked that the steadiest motive to business work is the desire for the pay, which is the material reward of work. Let me quote some recent statistics of the American economy. Data for the US economy show a decline in the employment rate over the past 2 decades. It was 64.5% in May 1999 and 60.4% in November 2018. Real wages for many workers have also been stagnant. In fact, they have declined. Here are some numbers. The real weekly earnings for production and non-supervisory workers in 1982 to $84 have not recovered to the 1972 levels. Real weekly earnings were about $341 in 1972, compared with about $312 in April 2018, a decline of 9%. In the face of these depressed wage earnings and very low participation rate of disadvantaged workers, what policy instruments should be employed to achieve economic justice? Following on from what Ned has talked about in this presentation, I shall adopt a Roshun perspective on economic justice for heterogeneous workers of differing productivity levels within a given generation. So that allows me to talk about intra-generational justice, and across generations, so I can talk about intergenerational justice. A basic idea of roles is to think of disadvantaged workers as being part of a society in which people do the things they do based upon their relative strengths or comparative advantage. A lawyer who has to ensure that the streets are clean and do all the other things to get his life going is not going to be as productive as when different people do things according to their comparative advantage and engage in collaboration, because then their society produces a social surplus. And it is out of their social surplus that it is possible to use a tax transfer system for the high wage earners who are highly rewarded by the market to pay tax revenues in order to lift up both the participation rate as well as the earnings of low-wage workers. I'd like to make 4 points in the time that I have. The first point is about making use of employment subsidies as a way to generate that intra-generational justice. It kind of highlights a scheme on Rewarding Work, which is the title of a 1997 book that Nat worked on, and a 2003 paper that I worked on with him that tried to get into the general equilibrium effects. But that's the first point I want to make and will elaborate on. The second point I'd like to make is that it makes sense, contrary to that argument of zero tax on capital, that to achieve intergenerational justice, society should have a mix of taxes both on labor as well as capital in order to lift up the participation rate of disadvantaged workers, because if they have been withdrawn away from the labor force, getting them into the labor force allows them to become worker savers and potentially contribute to a collaboration with the next generation who can benefit from higher wages, so that over their own lifetime, even though they have to pay taxes on their capital, to have a Pareto gain. The third point I want to make is about the possibility that when wealth adjusts, when wage taxes reduce the take-home wages of a high-wage earner, it is true that his labor supply is reduced on account of substitution effect. But because the take-home wage is reduced, and although consumption goes down, but does not go down by as much, his savings go down, and over time, the wealth adjustment has the potential to lift up the number of hours he works. That's the third point I shall make. Finally, I want to make the argument that in the future of work, where there is the potential of artificial intelligence potentially taking over some of our jobs, the right policy response is still employment subsidies that I shall argue, and not a universal basic income scheme. So I may not have time to elaborate on each of those points, but those are 4 points I'd like to make. So in what follows, I shall make brief remarks following those 4 points. The Roshun theory of economic justice is premised, as I've said, upon the notion that a social surplus is created when economic actors of differing productivity levels collaborate to engage in productive activities. An earlier literature on optimal taxation, beginning from the 1971 paper by James Merlis, assumed that labor supply adjusted only at the intensive margin. That's quite important. That earlier work, as well as Nat's own work in 73, that had the same assumption as Merlis, but assumed a Roshun social welfare function, they make the assumption that across the whole distribution of workers with different productivity level, they all are working. They all are working, but they adjust only the number of hours that they work. So hours are adjusted only at the intensive margin. In that sort of a theoretical world, it never makes sense to have an employment subsidy. It's essentially a negative marginal tax. I am giving you money when you are working. In the Jim Merlis model, with the assumption that everybody is already working, and people are only adjusting the number of hours they work, it does not make sense to get employment subsidy for the possibility that the higher productivity worker may pretend to be a lower productivity worker, being encouraged by the higher pay given to somebody with a lower productivity. Empirical research, however, shows that for workers at the lower end of the income distribution, the elasticity that really matters is at the extensive margin. In other words, for a very low-wage worker, the choice is not really about how many hours he wants to work. The choice is really about whether to work or not. And empirical evidence suggests quite strongly that at the lower end, the elasticity is between something like 0.5 to 1. In that world, it makes a lot of sense to have something like employment subsidy, so that when you work, although the market is not rewarding you, the government can have a scheme to lift up both your take-home pay, and in doing so, encourage more of these disadvantaged workers to work as well. And so I think that there is a pretty good empirical case as well as theoretical case really for a substantial employment subsidy to uplift the earnings of disadvantaged workers. In part, that allows them to enjoy the non-material rewards of work that Ned has talked about, that Marshall has talked about. Moreover, one of the theses of mass flourishing, which I have a sympathy for, is that innovation is not only centered around Silicon Valley. Innovation is really about people in all walks of life doing their job, finding that they really like their work and finding their ways of doing their work better. It is the bartender thinking about how to improve what he does. It is the cleaner finding a creative way to do his job. And if the whole swath of workers in society engage actively and enjoy their work, then I think there is the potential that you raise the productivity over the whole of the economy. So that allows me then to emphasize the second point. If it is the case that indeed when low-wage workers being encouraged by a higher take-home pay because of a substantial enough employment subsidy, and you see the participation rate that I've quoted to you raised from the low level to a much higher level, then there is a potential for an arrangement with the next generation of new workers so that this period, I'm willing not only to have people pay higher wage taxes, but pay a tax on their capital as well, because when they retire, they work with future workers who are more productive. And that allows a potential arrangement to enjoy intergenerational justice as well. So it is not the case that we should think of the economy as a Ramsey infinite horizon dynasty of families growth model, because in that model, it is the case that taxing interest income creates a distortion in the relative price of present to future consumption that grows increasingly large as time goes far into the future. On the other hand, in the sort of model that I've been discussing, an overlapping generations model where today's young people live alongside future young people when they themselves become old, that allows for mutual cooperation across generations. On to my point about the adjustment of wealth to a high wage tax. For high income earners, the participation elasticity is low. So if you're at the very high end of income distribution, the question is not so much whether to work or not. Well, the pay is high enough to ensure that you will want to work. So, but at the higher end, the elasticity at the intensive margin, it tends to be somewhat higher. In that world, the substitution effect from standard labor economics indeed predicts that a higher labor income tax in lowering the after-tax wage leads to a shift towards more leisure. That's the argument sometimes people make about why Europeans work far fewer hours than the Americans, because they are paying a higher labor tax. But that's really only taking wealth as given in the short run. The reason is that the labor tax also causes a decumulation of individual wealth, as a cutback in consumption typically is less than the decline in after-tax wage. Feeling less wealthy, the worker cuts back on leisure and supplies more hours of work. This acts to attenuate the shrinkage of the tax base due to the disincentive effect of higher labor taxes. In fact, it is not difficult to show theoretically that if I have an economy that takes a world interest rate as given, imposing a labor tax in the short run will reduce the number of hours worked. But when wealth has adjusted, you will be back exactly to the same number of hours you had worked before the labor tax was imposed. So there shouldn't be this great fear that for the high-wage workers with a higher labor tax in order to finance the employment subsidy, that will permanently create a disincentive to work as hard. My final point. Advances in artificial intelligence and robotics have led to the fear that robots would take jobs away from human workers. In response, there have been various proposals for universal basic income. The economist Hilary Hoynes has done a useful survey of universal basic incomes, and she has drawn two conclusions that I will just mention. She has argued that implementing a universal benefit that is set at the poverty level in the US would be extremely expensive. Secondly, that replacing the current social safety net with a universal basic income would be regressive because essentially you are going to remove some of the schemes that are benefiting the very low end and move them up to benefit the people at the middle. My point, however, is that employment subsidy is preferable because precisely it is non-neutral in incentivizing firms to employ low-wage workers, whereas a universal basic income is neutral as to working or not working. Some types of robots perfectly substitute for human labor in certain jobs, some of which are performed by low-wage workers. On the other hand, there are also robots that boost the productivity of human labor in other jobs. So let me end with this point. I think that the way to deal with the possible entry of robots is to recognize that jobs, even jobs at the low end, themselves are endogenous. In other words, a job is made up of different functions, and the robots can do only some of those functions. Some other new functions will be created because the robots can help, in fact, the low-end workers to do better jobs. Think of a nurse who's getting old and finds it very hard to leave patients. Exoskeletons can help them, perform their jobs better. So finally, the response, I think, to the possible entry of robots is employment subsidies and possibly a fund to train some of the low-end workers so that they will be able to function in new jobs that we can create for them. Thank you very much.
When Ned asked me about a month ago to talk about taxes, I thought I would start by gathering the data. So I set out with my very clever and industrious colleague, Valeria Shevarano-Kina, to get to the bottom of things, to see how progressive are taxes really in the US, and have they become more or less progressive with the 2017 tax reform. And we quickly found that there was no bottom, that we would dig and come up with a conclusion, and the more we dug, there was more to learn. And the only people that seemed to draw sharp conclusions were on the left or the right, and their conclusions seemed to match their political agendas. There are some things, though, that we can say clearly, so I just thought I would start off by reporting those to you. The first thing that everybody knows, for sure, is that Warren Buffett said in 2007 that he pays a lower tax rate. The meme is than his secretary, he actually said than his receptionist. He said that he pays 17%, which sounds right to me. If his income was long-term capital gains, mostly at the time, that was taxed in 2007 at a 15% rate. Now it's taxed at 20%. He would have paid Nebraska state income tax, which is surprisingly progressive, at about a 5.5% rate, which he would have been able to deduct against his federal tax, which he can no longer do. And then he, now, this was before Obamacare, which has a 2.45% rate with no cap. So he might be closer to 23% now, but it's mostly an artifact of the low tax rate on long-term capital gain, not some mysterious trove of loopholes that the rich can reach in and grab whenever they like in order to reduce their tax to whatever rate they care to pay. And you know, the impression that this has created, that always and everywhere people in high income can pay low tax rates, it's simply not true. I take as an example, let's look at a 1%er in New York. To get in the top 1% of households in the 5 boroughs, it's $793,000 household income. The average of the 1% is $2.93 million. So let's just assume for simplicity that we have someone who is a household, 2 people who are married, and all their income is earned. We will ignore property tax, payroll tax, and any other tax besides city, state income tax and federal income tax. So let's look at what this person pays. Before tax reform, the total tax rate was 48% of the person's 2.93 million income. I'm not saying this is too high or too low. I don't want to pass judgment. I just want to report the facts here. And this, if the person was self-employed, say a doctor or a lawyer or a fund manager, they would also have New York City unincorporated business tax, and they would have another self-employment tax. We'll just keep it simple here. After tax reform, there was a shift in brackets, there was a shift in tax rates, and above all, there was a elimination of reduction of state and local taxes. And I once thought I would show all this data, and it was impossible. So just a couple of case studies are all we can do in this short time we have allowed. So this person's tax went up to 50% following tax reform. But it's not so simple. If instead we look at a Chick-fil-A franchisee in Texas, before tax reform, this person paid 40%. And afterwards, it went down because of there's no state tax, income tax in Texas, and a 20% reduction in pass-through income from LLCs. This person's tax went down to 29%. So there are case studies on all sides. We look at someone who has a median income for the United States as a whole. The median household income is about $60,000. In the very simplistic case where I'm ignoring many complexities that this person would encounter, the total tax rate would fall from about 12% to 6%. This chart shows the total income tax share by taxpayer income going back by BEA data, going back from 2001. I can't go quite past 2016. The IRS hasn't yet released this data, but ultimately very stable shares. The top is the contribution of the top 1%, then the next 24%, the third quartile, and then the bottom 50%, which account for about 3% of federal tax receipts. In 2016, in contrast to the top 1% that paid 37% in income tax. We are able to see, to get some data that the IRS has released, not quite enough to continue that graph, but to show overall that the effect of the 2017 tax reform was to increase the share of taxpayers earning over $500,000, but not by a huge amount, and a small decrease in the biggest decrease in households between 40,000 and 70,000, which is very hard to see on this slide. But it's about 1% down for those households and about 1.5% up as a result of 2017 tax reform. Current government receipts have gone down. We go up from the blue up to the green is from 2017 to estimated 2019. One thing we can say for sure is that corporate tax rates have gone down. The corporate tax take went down by about $80 million. There was an increase in customs duties and excise taxes that slightly offset that. A small overall reduction in personal tax rates because there are more people on the lower income band. However, while there was a slash in corporate taxes, there wasn't that much to slash. In the 1950s, corporate taxes accounted for 33% of the total tax receipts, 6% of GDP. Before tax reform, that was down to 6% of tax receipts and about 1% of GDP. After tax reform, that's dropped to 0.7% of GDP and 4% of tax receipts. There wasn't really that much, there isn't that much corporate tax to cut. We haven't relied on corporate taxes for quite a long time, for better or for worse. I'm not complaining, I'm not applauding this, I think it's interesting to report the facts because that meme of Warren Buffett has taken hold. And there's maybe for some people it's true, but I think for most it's not. I'd like to use my remaining few minutes as we are advertising our books here today to have a commercial announcement for my own. And to, it's called Willful, How We Choose What We Do, published by Yale University Press on November 12th, available wherever fine books are sold. The argument that I make in my book, or part of the argument, is very sympathetic to what Ned and Hian Teck have said, that many of our actions are undertaken for a purpose that we can understand, to maximize our preferences subject to the resources that we have, but a large component are not, that they're undertaken for themselves, to overcome an authentic challenge, to pit our skills against others, for an authentic altruistic gesture, to act in accordance with our beliefs that constitute our identity that we're committed to. And this gives us a lens through which to see our engagement with work, where it's much more, for many people, and maybe for everybody, it's more than just a sacrifice of leisure in order to get money for consumption. And I have my own quote from who appears to be the man of the hour, Alfred Marshall. And I'm glad that Hian Teck didn't use this quote. Just as a racehorse or an athlete strains every nerve to get in advance of his competitors and delights in the strain, so a manufacturer or a trader is often stimulated by much more by the hope of victory over his rivals than by the desire to add something to his fortune. And Marshall goes on to say that economists ought to consider that in their calculations. So that work has a dual character, partly to get the goods and the substance of our lives, and partly as the ultimate sport that we play. So if we see the efforts of the super rich, one could argue that, well, they're not going to work less, that they reached the point where they play, this is the game they play, running a business or undertaking some other activity that at which they're quite skilled. They might even work more. And in principle, you could argue that this would be a pro-growth thing, in the sense that you could therefore lower the taxes, but not by very much because there aren't that many of them, and use that to create low-wage subsidies that Hian Teck has been talking about. So I think it would be quite a strain, looking at it this way, to say that there'll be less labor supply from the super rich, I think misunderstands why they would come to work and do what they do. However, it's easy to say that we should tax wealth. it's an order of magnitude harder to measure than it is to measure income. It would be like calculating an estate tax every year. We have a picture here of Jimi Hendrix, who died in 1970, whose estate is still open and has not yet been settled. He writes Purple Haze. The royalties have value. Do you assess that value by an actuary and then tax him 2% of that every year of his life? And then as it rises in the charts, its value becomes greater and therefore his wealth tax goes up. And this will be, unlike an estate tax, the rich will still be alive with all their cunning and guile to try to avoid it. And when we try to assess the impact on growth, the deadweight cost of all of the efforts undertaken to try to avoid the wealth tax would be not inconsiderable. So before jumping to the conclusion, it's something that's easier said than done. All right, I've used up my time, so I'll thank you and turn it over to Gylfi.
Right. Their presentations beforehand, I thought there were two issues that I wanted to expand on. The first one is the one raised by Ned about the disconnect between established tenets in economics and political discourse. And for those of us who live outside the US, it's quite amazing to watch, on the one hand, a country with these amazing universities, think tanks, leaders in most sciences, economics, so forth. And then the quality of the public debate and often the quality of the decisions made by the government. So what explains this? And I think it's easy to blame the politicians, but it's also, I think, the problem with the economics profession, that the language of economics, the incentives in universities, how it's, what the priorities are in the profession are not conducive to promoting public good. That's one problem. The other problem is the misuse of economics in the past, of which there are plenty of examples. The efficiency market theory, rational expectation hypothesis, and so forth. All of this can be misconstrued by forgetting about the assumptions and so forth. So I think it's a problem with economics, but it's also a problem with the politicians. But the effects are real. So we have this massive country slashing tariffs on others to reduce the current account deficit. So the current account deficit is that lack of saving, there's more investment than saving. You use foreign saving to pay for domestic spending. And it's not clear how tariffs are going to solve that problem. In Europe, we have a similar problem. Germany is the biggest, most important country there at the moment. They have a massive current account surplus. And the German politicians apparently don't see that as a problem, that 8% of German output has to be bought by someone else. And these surpluses have caused big problems in Southern Europe, so they exported these surpluses to the periphery to let others borrow to buy their own goods until they couldn't borrow anymore, and then blame it on the borrowers. So we had a crisis in Europe, so it was Ireland, Spain, Italy is in trouble, Greece, my native Iceland. It's so easy to blame it on those who borrowed the money to buy the surplus output of the Germans and the Dutch, of the Northern Europeans. And now we have the whole of the Eurozone has developed a surplus vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Italy has a surplus because of the demand compression and unemployment inside its country. So it's like on the two sides of the ocean. On the one side, there's a country that think it's natural to export much more than they import, and then to want to borrow and invest their surplus savings. On this side of the ocean, there's a government that thinks this is a conspiracy and wants to put tariffs on German cars. So both are missing something. So in this disconnect that Ned was talking about between established tenets in economics and politics, we have the emergence of a new type of politics based on charismatic leaders defining the interests of the native population against someone, defying international cooperation, and so forth. But the good news is that so far the damage done to the economy is limited. Even in the UK, where politics has become kind of almost a comedy, the effect on the British economy is very limited. It's mostly the exchange rate that has moved. Over here, the economy has been booming, so unemployment is at a 50-year low. So in the short term, the threat from the politics that has risen in this vacuum, in this disconnect between economics and politics, has mainly threatened the integrity of institutions. So it's sort of the rule of law, the courts, and so forth that are under threat. But now we're seeing the first sign of the policies also affecting economic performance. So the tariffs appear to be inflicting damage on manufacturing output throughout the world and triggering a recession. So the disconnect, this disconnect between, and Ned is talking about, between the public decisions and what we think we know about economics is really having serious effects. And I think the economics profession has to sort of reflect what it's doing wrong, why it's not getting the message through. And I think the explanations are that the language is too incomprehensible to most others, and maybe too much politics in the economics profession, saying only one-sided results, and the misuse of economics. So that was the first point. I think is really important because the way the world is moving. But the second point regarding their proposals. So the U.S. here has a booming economy, but it has these issues with the division of wealth and income across groups. And it seems that the bulk of the population has not gained from trade, international trade, or productivity growth. So economists say free trade is good, but what happens if more than 50% of the population doesn't gain? So they get upset and vote for unorthodox politicians, and we have a mess. The effects of this inequalities are found in longevity, like what we heard from Angus Deaton last year here. Shorter life expectancy among non-college whites. People in states where income is less equally distributed live, on average, have a shorter lifespan than in states where income is more equally distributed. And so there's a problem. In a booming economy, there seems to be a problem with large segments of the population. So that what Richard, Ned, and Hian Teck have proposed is a tax on corporate profits distributed in a Rawlsian way to the needy and making work more rewarding. Employment subsidies, that's one idea. I have just a couple of comments on this. The first one is regarding the corporate profit tax. So what corporations do these days is that they shift profits between countries. So in Europe, we have two countries that basically import tax revenues. So that's Luxembourg. So you make money from importing other people's tax revenues, and Ireland. And it's one of the big failures of the European Union is not to rein in this activity. But sometimes you see it in the papers, like I remember Starbucks is big in the UK. Then some journalists discovered that Starbucks doesn't pay any taxes in the UK. People got upset for like a day or so, and then life goes on. So if you're a worker, you cannot decide to pay taxes in Luxembourg or Ireland. But if you're a capitalist, you can do that. So you can create value in one country and shift profits to another. It seems to be something fundamentally wrong with this. And then if we increase the profit tax, will that affect the tax base? I think one of the arguments for cutting corporate profit taxes here was to get US corporations to shift profits back home. But it seems in Europe this is clearly a problem, and the European Union would become a lot more popular among the population. It took action, but we had the slight challenge that the head of the European Commission was the former Prime Minister of Luxembourg. It's made it more difficult to implement. But now he's retiring, so maybe things will change. So that's one point on corporate profit taxes. Then Richard talked about personal income tax. So in terms of the social welfare function, so you mentioned roles. It just seemed, when I was looking at the numbers, that in the US, the median income earner might weigh heavily in the social welfare function, because the tax on the median income, according to OECD data, the tax on the median income here is quite low. So that if the government here wanted to pay for all the military spending and the rest, paid for the median earner, it's not very popular. But
that's the only place to go, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so no, but the last point is that the problems in terms of the distribution of income and wealth here seem so profound in this booming economy that such a large segment of the population feels left out, that it's a danger to democracy, and it doesn't feel right. And so that what you need to do, I think, is to do something even more profound. But of course, that would be politically impossible. But you could, well, the minimum wage, there was a proposal. Have they raised it to $15 now? Has that gone through? That was
No, not nationally. No,
that was a
just here.
discussion.
Yeah. In New York it is.
So in terms of established economic tenet, raising the minimum wage may not hurt employment too much. That would be one way of doing it. Having unions, yeah, this would be, sounds very socialist, but having unions on the board of corporations, so that the interests of the workers are taken into account, not just the interests of the capitalist. If they're workers working for a corporation, the value of the corporation is the value of the human capital of the workers and the capital, fiscal capital, that you take both into account. So when you destroy the match, that you take both the interests of the worker and the... that's another idea. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's...